Great. Lauren, well, welcome to the Interviewist. I will give a little rundown on your background so people know more about you. You are a award-winning marketing communications and content marketing consultant. You started your career as a journalist first at the tender age of 19, writing for dailies, weeklies, monthly magazines, especially around the Philadelphia area. In 2011-ish, you moved to Sydney, Australia, and ran a travel blog while also continuing to freelance in both journalism and content marketing. Triple threat. You've spent time in-house running content marketing operations for Datacom and MediaMath. In 2001, you went solo, and you're currently consulting mostly for, it looks like, software companies, PR firms, content agencies, a lot on AI, identity, cookies, data, e-commerce, retail, more. And if people want to see where your work has appeared, you've got a long list, a long rap sheet, CNN, USA Today, HuffPo, Entrepreneur, all those good places. Did I miss anything, number one?
Just Google me, you can find everything I've ever written or that's been written about me. No, that you made me sound great. Thank you.
Well, you have a good bio for me to work from. Awesome. Well, let's just dive in. The first question I like to ask everyone, can you just tell me about generally what your involvement with interviewing is today, what it looks like?
Yes, absolutely. And just very excited to be here. So thank you for having me. I'm excited for our conversation. Yeah, so I'm actually doing quite a bit of different types of interviewing right now. My main type of interviewing is interviewing subject matter experts, SMEs. I like to call them SMEs, like SME from the movie Hook. Around, very technical, technology-driven topics for the SaaS companies that you referenced when you were introducing me. But I also work as a journalist for a magazine called Loss Prevention, which is geared towards loss prevention, asset prevention professionals at major retailers. And it's all around, preventing loss or theft, whether external or internal, making stores safer, how technology is woven into the process. And that's more, kind of straight journalistic interviewing where I might, interview a police detective for one story, or someone at Target or Ulta for another, or a government official. So that sort of harkens back to my early days of interviewing where I got my start as a reporter in Philly. And then I also work for Ad Age's custom content studio, which is sort of a hybrid, I feel like, of my content marketing and my journalism skills because they're clients who are paying for these pieces to get published on Ad Age, but I still have to interview them. And they usually provide, kind of key topics and bullets they want to hit, but I'm still tasked with coming up with the questions and ultimately leading the interview. So I've had some fun experiences interviewing, people from Amazon Ads, and a recent one is DoorDash. So, it kind of keeps it interesting that I have sort of three different buckets of interviewing going right now.
Totally. And at some point, I'd love to dig in maybe later in our conversation for that third bucket, the kind of they paid to have this feature, but I'm interviewing them. I've done a few of those in the past, and I find it's a really weird kind of niche because you're like, I want to feature you and have this be authentic, but also not have just the canned like PR paragraph. So we'll talk about that later. But
Yeah.
I wanna derail immediately from our conversation here. One thing that I've been asking people lately, what would you consider your superpower for interviewing? And then conversely, what's kind of the most challenging aspect of it for you personally?
Yes. And I'm thinking of my old travel blogging buddy, Stephanie Yoder, who's appeared on this podcast as well, because she talked about how she's, you know, pretty laid back and informal as an interviewer and just as a person in general, which I can attest to having met her. She's great. But I'm similar. I'm very informal. I'm very conversational, because I feel like that builds rapport. And I think finding, I feel like we can all find one thing in common with everyone we meet, no matter how different we are, our backgrounds. We're all human beings. We all have a certain set of shared experiences. So I kind of try to mine for that gem in either my background research before I interview someone or during the flow of the conversation, even if it's just like, hey, we know 10 of the same people on LinkedIn, or hey, you went to college in Philly like I did, or you spent some time in somewhere I've lived. And I think that does help relax the subjects. And I think, I just try to come at it as like this is a conversation. It's not an interrogation. Don't even think of it as an interview. It's a chat. I just need some information. I'm not out, I'm not out for blood. I'm not trying to destroy your image or like, get really sensitive, information made public. And I think the more challenging aspect is that if despite all my best efforts, an interview subject just clams up or just doesn't have much to say to me, which sometimes is about that person's personality and maybe lack of comfort being interviewed. Then it is about me. It could be about me sometimes, and just for some reason I haven't established that rapport. And I have experienced that a little bit over the years, whether it's a technical SME or someone for a newspaper or magazine story. They're just sort of like one or a few word answers, and you just kind of can't get them going. And sometimes it just is what it is, and you have to leave it at that.
Do you know, just like a quick follow-up, what's that line for you where you're like, I'm all out of my tricks. I can't get anything more. I've just got to go with it versus I should keep digging. Is there a point where you know?
I think I always end almost every single interview with like, is there anything I haven't asked that I should have or that you want to tell me that you think is relevant to the story or the blog post or the white paper? And if that doesn't sort of get them going and sort of open them up more, that's usually the point where I'm like, okay, this is I have some things I can take from this, but otherwise I think we're just gonna stop. And maybe I'll follow up and see if over email they're a little more comfortable. And I do tend to offer that to no matter who I'm interviewing for any of those three buckets I mentioned up front. Like if it's just easier, you don't have time, or you're more comfortable writing out your answers. I always feel like writing out answers is probably more laborious for people, but some people prefer that versus getting on a half-hour call or a Zoom. So that's
Yes.
usually what I do.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting because I do that sometimes too, especially some of these SMEs, especially the technical ones, are like, I'm going to be in 10 different places. Can you email? Is there any instance when you wouldn't do email questions, like where you're like, no, we need a call for this kind of interview?
I think probably. Well, I think if it's a technical topic that I really don't know about or I'm lost on and I need somebody to actually walk me through it, potentially with even visuals, if it's like a Zoom call and they're screen sharing maybe a deck or something, which that's happened a lot too, because of the SaaS background I come from. But then I would say too, if it's, I've interviewed a lot of police before, over the last 20 years that I've been a journalist. And I feel like that lends itself more to like a phone conversation because if you're talking about something from an investigative perspective, I just think sometimes those sources can be a little bit more forthcoming over a call or even an in-person meeting than email
Interesting. Yeah.
and might open up more. And everything, they always are upfront with what I can share, obviously on the record, off the record, but I just find with those types of sources, they tend to just talk once I get them on the phone versus
Yeah.
over email.
Interesting. And do you think that's like a profession thing, like a personality thing? I guess just digging into this a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like, police, and detectives like they're in person with people all the time. Like if they're out, patrolling on the street, like interrogating someone, like it is very much a more person to person type of job versus being in tech and working for a tech company where people are distributed all over, working from home and everything is mostly on Slack or Zoom or over email. So I do think it's the nature of certain professions for sure that they're more comfortable talking.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I'd love to dig in a little bit more into your background. Like I said earlier, you're kind of a triple threat. You've done journalism, content marketing, blogging, hitting kind of all of these different communications, writing fields. Um, And I know you've been interviewing for roughly 20 years, so you have this wide lens. I think interviewing, especially the past maybe 2 years, has really changed. So, can you kind of talk us through your evolution of interviewing? What were your kind of approaches, tools, best practices when you started? What do they look like now? How have they changed?
When I started, I mean, it just feels like a completely different world, and in many ways it was. It was actually the summer of 2001, so it really was a different world because it was just before 9/11. And I just it was funny. I was an English major. I was a newly declared English major, but I knew I wanted to write, but I didn't know what type of writing. And I was sort of like, why don't I just try my hand at writing for a newspaper anywhere in my side of Jersey, which is at the Jersey Shore is where I'm from. So I literally went in the phone book because that's how long ago this was and like looked up numbers for all the different like small community newspapers. And then, from the Star Ledger, I knew I wasn't going to
Yeah.
get that, but like I kind of just like blanketed whoever was, the law of numbers. If I call enough people, someone will say yes. And then one of the small papers in my community was called the Brick Communicator. I actually don't even know if it still exists. My family moved out of that town, but they were like, yeah, we'll pay you $25 a story. Like, let's try you out. And I had no idea what I was doing. Everything was in person. I had to go to things, go to events, meet people in person. Some things were over the phone. But I had my notepad and my little pen, and I'm just trying to like fervently take notes. And I was so green, and I think, lacking confidence at the time that I was just sort of basic questions. Like I did not probe much beyond surface. And I really didn't need to for this particular paper or role.
Yeah.
But I was like sort of completely self-taught, so I didn't really have a technique and I wasn't even a journalism major. I wasn't even writing for the school paper yet. So I really like was just out on my own. But that was a forcing function, I think, to get my feet wet, get over being nervous, have some of those awkward interviews and moments, and then move on from there. And the following year, my sophomore year, I did become an editor on the school paper. And then by my senior year, I was freelancing for a paper in Philly. And at that point, after, 4 years of college and just, I think, learning how to meet and work with different people, my peers, classmates, professors, even having some jobs in and outside of college. I was much more comfortable talking to people. I, at that point, knew how to build rapport. I was very young, so I think some of my editors and sources also took me under their wing and were like, "She's green, but she shows promise, and she can talk to people." And I think that really helped. Like that, at that point, I was being nurtured finally in how to interview, how to be a journalist, how to be a writer, how to be a reporter. I had some critical thinking skills from being in college for 4 years. And, now, there's so much that's changed, but, now everything to, our conversation a few minutes ago can be over Zoom, over the phone, over email. It's so much less in person, and you can do, I think, so much more pre-prep too. Like the internet was around obviously in 2001, but not to the degree it is now. And so there's so much more research and preparation you can do, which makes then the interviews and the conversations far less awkward because you can be so well prepared.
Yeah.
And you can even look up all these other articles on the internet or places your source has spoken or been interviewed before so that you're not asking the same questions that they've already been asked. So I think it's easier now.
Yes. I was going to kind of ask if you felt like there are pros and cons. I love this pro of kind of easier research so you can have better conversations. I hadn't thought about it that way. Do you have any thoughts, feelings, hot takes on kind of in person versus the shift to all these different channels for interviews now, I guess?
Well, I mean, I think in person still, which I don't feel like I do so much anymore. Almost everything is either over phone or Zoom or email. And there's a chance that could change depending on the story going forward because I've pitched a couple Philly focused stories since I'm down in South Jersey to the Loss Prevention magazine I write for instance, the World Cup will be here next year. So I've pitched that as a story from like a retail perspective. So I imagine I might have some in-person Philly interviews for that, which I'm excited about. Um, I think, in person, you have body language cues and eye contact. You can see if something you've asked has made someone uncomfortable. You can maybe see that on a video call like Zoom, but there's filters, you can't see someone's full body. Like you can see their face, but I think you do miss some things from a body language perspective when you're doing everything online. And I think though too, you could potentially probe a little deeper when you're with someone in person, especially if you do make that connection and have rapport very quickly and they feel comfortable with you. There's this distance between us, right? When we're on our computers, like we can see each other, but it's still online and we're not together in person. So it just feels like there's a little bit something removed sometimes.
Totally. Do you, and I was thinking as you've been talking, kind of creating this connection, to me, it would seem like that's most important in maybe more your journalistic work versus maybe interviewing an SME for a SaaS blog or whatnot. Do you agree with that? Or could you kind of talk a little bit about your approach to kind of shifting between journalism, content marketing, how you're interviewing and thinking about it?
Yeah, I think, I am pretty upfront with technical SMEs, from the beginning. And still today, if there's things, new innovations in tech that I just don't know anything about, that I don't know what I don't know, like please teach me what you know so I can write about it coherently and accurately. So I try to it's hard. Everybody's time strapped. So sometimes, especially if it's an SME with a full-time day job, they're like, I don't have time to like talk to you for 45 minutes on this blog post you want to write, like that's marketing. Like what we're doing is we're building products,
Right.
But if I appeal to them as like, no, I really need your help. Like you are the expert and no one else is going to be able to give me this information the right way, the accurate way, the way you can tell me because you've built this thing. I think that's the type of rapport building I do, almost building up that person and being like, you have the knowledge. You are
Yeah.
the Yoda. You are the Yoda. I need to tap into you. But it's funny, like, because as journalists, you are also interviewing people who have day jobs and are giving you their time separate from that for whatever you're working on. But for some reason, it just feels a little bit different in my experience in tech, where people are like, no, we're so busy. Like, you need to really make this worth our while for us to talk to you. So I try to do that up front.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like, do you think it's just the stakes feel a little bit different? I think in journalism, well, I think everywhere people don't want to sound dumb, but
Yes.
do you feel like what's kind of that different factor between the journalism asking for time and the SMEs at these SaaS companies?
I think often in journalism, it's like, either something for, and I don't want to say that tech companies aren't producing things for the public good because everything is serving a purpose, but it's not necessarily, revenue product driven, consumer driven. It's, you're writing about something that might be because there's a wave of crime or there's some call to action from like, we need government to do something or we need a group of people to organize because something bad is happening. And I think there's maybe a little bit more of that in journalism where it's like, no, this is going to help more people. Like if I talk to this journalist, this is an important story that needs to get told, and I want to be a part of it because if something good comes from it, then I'm attached to that. And if I don't give a comment or if I don't participate, and I miss out on that, I miss out on that cachet. And conversely, like if something the bad outcome happens from not talking to me. It's like, oh, if I would have talked to her instead of being like, oh, no comment, or this person never replied, like that's going to make me and my business and my department, whatever, look bad. So I
Right.
think there's a little bit more of that where it's like if someone at one of my tech clients decides not to talk to me, they're not gonna lose their job. We're not gonna
Yeah.
lose revenue. There's that sort of other side of the coin.
Yeah.
Like, is it necessary? Is marketing necessary? And yes, of course it is, but there's that, like which is more, necessary for the public good? Is it the newspaper story or is it the tech blog?
Yeah, yeah, I think that that definitely nails it. I also wanted to ask you about this is following up on what you were talking about earlier, kind of the evolution, scribbling notes to today. We have this wealth of info at our fingertips. Just practically speaking, like I know when I started my career 10 years ago, I was taking all my notes by hand, trying to transcribe things on my own. Now we have all this tool. What does your kind of tool stack look like these days? Are you still taking notes by hand? Are you using an AI note taker? What's your go-to resources?
I will use a little bit of AI note taking. I do like to record Zoom calls, and I will always ask up front if that's okay. But it's very common practice, I feel like, across especially the tech clients I'm working for, and even Ad Age, like they'll automatically record calls or have an AI note taker already embedded in Zoom taking
Yeah.
notes. I do use my phone sometimes. I've had to record off my phone, my cell phone. Um, I will, this isn't from a recording standpoint, but even using Grammarly and Chat GPT and started to dip more into AI in that way to like organize notes, clean up notes, do some research in Chat GPT, just, even if it's background articles I need to read, that's kind of all part of my toolkit. So it's simple, but it's there.
Yeah, definitely. No, I agree. How I'm still at the point where I'm using ChatGPT and whatnot to help me maybe brainstorm extra interview questions, or I'll use a note taker to give me kind of the key points from an interview, but I still am like, do I need to read through this whole thing to check it? Like that confidence, I'm not quite there yet.
Yeah, same. I'm not at the point where I'm using ChatGPT to like spit out first drafts, but definitely starting to leverage it more for research and just, what I found some of the outputs of ChatGPT will not give you an actual source link to certain things. And then I'll spend more time trying to Google that title of whatever it was or find the source than if I just Googled it to begin with. So there's definitely, it's AI. It will continually get better and learn, but I definitely, yeah, I'm still gut checking what it gives me.
Yeah, definitely a best practice. Yeah. Um, One thing I was curious about too, kind of as interviewing has changed, we have new channels now too to distribute content. Do you feel like the people you've interviewed have changed at all, kind of in their approach to being interviewed? This might be
Hmm.
a bit of a leading question. I'm not trying to fish, but
No, that's interesting. I don't, I feel like the comparison would be like when I was first reporting almost 20 years ago, well, 20 years ago actually, this year, um, to now. And I feel like I don't necessarily find this with my own sources. However, I just think generally with the advent of social media and PR and influencer marketing, everybody has a brand now that they need to protect. And you could argue everybody's always had a brand, but that conversation's happening much more now than it was 20 years ago when online wasn't what it was. There was no Facebook or anything like that, or Instagram or TikTok. So I feel like sometimes, if you listen to celebrity interviews today versus 20 years ago, they're not really giving you much depth
yeah,
because everybody has a PR firm, everybody has a publicist, and because anything can be misconstrued and then disseminated out across dozens of channels and live forever, people hold back a little bit more. And again, I don't feel like I've personally found that, and I'm not ever really interviewing celebrities. But I do think with certain people, celebrities, maybe certain professions, it's just there's so much more protection around the image of the person or the company they represent than there was. And
totally.
that can always lead to detailed answers in interviews.
Yes, I find this so interesting. I think this ties back to what I brought up earlier, your third bucket of interviewing with these companies. They've paid for a feature, but you're still interviewing them to try and get some more authentic feel out of them. How do you balance that? How do you dig in enough to still have an authentic conversation without just having like, here are the three bullet points that PR told me to talk about in this thing?
Right. Well, I feel like with marketing content in general, if it's going to have a selling point ever, it comes at the end, like a direct sell. Or it's like, hey, we just launched this new product, or come meet us at Cannes Lion. It shouldn't be interwoven or in the middle of the piece. It should be thought leadership. And then if you need to CTA to something a little more salesy, you will. Um, I still will try to, write and talk about and ask questions that maybe subtly point to whatever the solution or product is, or what the features or tenets are that the reader might want to consider when they're looking for a solution like this, but not mentioning the product outright, more than once. And that's usually a directive I'm also given, from my clients,
Mhm.
uh, particularly ad age too, where it's sort of you're blending. You're kind of a journalist at one point, but a content marketer on the other. And you know, I've been in journalism so long that sort of that the battle between like sales and editorial, and like trying to prevent the print paper from becoming a whole advertorial. Like I still remember those days. So I think about that sometimes, when certain projects come up, and I'm like, okay, this is not an advertorial. This is like advertorial light, because they are paying for this, but we're not going to make like, 2 pages about like why this product is so great. So it's funny having had that background, because I'm just like, it's not an advertorial. You can't make it an advertorial. Like, don't do that.
Yeah. Do you feel like that helps you kind of ask different questions, I suppose? I'm kind of, mhm.
Yes, actually, because I think it sort of prompts me to ask questions about the wider industry, or what the trends are in that specific area or product area that we're going to write about. So it's more sort of forward looking as well, and sort of becomes like, well, what should the reader keep in mind, like as this space is evolving? Like, yes, we want them to buy our product or service, but like more broadly, if our, there's in tech as well, obviously there's always competitors and things, but sort of with a lot of companies I work with, it's this idea of like we all want to sort of work together, even if we're competitors, because the rising tide lifts all boats, and we all have a responsibility to make the internet a safe, lucrative place, where sort of everyone wins, where consumer privacy wins, but publishers can still monetize their content and advertisers can still make money for their brands. Sort of, I also try to do, have that kind of the advertising or tech for good piece in there as well, and ask questions around that. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we really doing this? How are we all working together to make the internet and technology better, safer, whatever?
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really cool, especially because I think, there's a lot of doom scrolling and tendency to kind of more panic or look at the bad side of tech. So it's cool to hear like, okay, what's the good that we're aiming for here? I like that's a cool angle. One thing that I really want to make sure I talk to you about, because we haven't really, I've spoken to Stephanie Yoder, of course, but we didn't dig into her travel blog too much. So you worked in Australia. Um, I would love to just hear if you noticed any cultural nuances, differences that you had to adjust to when working, interviewing over there
Yes.
versus in the US.
Yes, so it was kind of surprising. So I actually got my content marketing start in Australia 13 years ago this February, as a content specialist for an IT company called Datacom. And they were mostly in just the Asia Pacific region. But my boss was from Chicago. So, and I loved her. Shout out Tracy Toth. And we were referred to as the two loud Americans in the office.
Gosh.
So right off the bat, it was sort of like, oh gosh, like these American marketers, like they're loud, they want to talk to us all the time. And, Australians are so fun. I'm actually really hoping, to go back with my family later this year, for the first time in 15 years since we moved, my husband, then partner, moved back. But, they're so fun. They love to have a good time, but there are nuances to like their humor, and to what I think they're willing to accept professionally. So like, they'll go have a boozy lunch, or, there would be a beer or wine cart that came around at 4 p.m. every Friday. But if you told the wrong joke, or if you asked something sort of a little off kilter, or cheeky, as they like to call it, not everybody loved that. And I just, I struggle with that, because because I think the persona is like they're so fun, they work hard, they play hard. But then there was a limit sometimes to my own humor and to sort of what I could ask people, even if it was like technical SMEs at Datacom. And I think sometimes, they also had this they were more comfortable with sort of marketing light, like they didn't want to be shouting about, their name from the rooftops. They didn't want to be boastful. They didn't, a little bit opposite of American culture, honestly. So I found that tricky to navigate sometimes. How to ask questions the right way while sort of being authentic to my own personality, but not offending anyone and getting the information I needed to produce whatever piece of content I was working on. And I did find some sources there that would clam up. They were the very first technical sources I ever interviewed, and it made me better at doing it once I got back to the States and joined MediaMath. But yeah, that was one thing I was really surprised to experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially about the humor. I would imagine that's really challenging because I know I use humor to try and break the ice sometimes. So
Yeah.
if that's different, I almost imagine that's like harder to make that connection up front.
Yeah, where if you're used to sort of disarming people or warming up to people that way and you have to sort of scale it back, yeah, it could be a little abrupt and a little jarring, but I learned as I went.
Do you have any tips if someone, for example, um, maybe gets a new international client or is working abroad? How do you recommend kind of getting in the groove with interviewing, learning the culture enough to be comfortable? Do you have any tips along those lines?
I think, definitely Googling, what different phrases and terminology mean.
Yeah.
And I didn't get into that with the previous question, but there are definitely, there are certain basic ones like in Australia, a shrimp is called a prawn, a pepper is called a capsicum, but then there are other phrases that here mean one thing and there mean something completely different and inappropriate. So it's like always check that so you don't say a phrase or ask a question that is offensive
Yeah.
in that culture. And I think just, reading other newspapers and online publications there to see how other interviews, the kind of quotes they get, the kind of points they make, the kind of questions even that you can tell they asked by reading the article to kind of learn how far you can push
Mhm.
and when you might need to take a pause. Because I just think every country and every culture has, a different limit on what they're willing to share, how much banter they're willing to engage in, the type of humor again. So I think learning that up front so you don't make a mistake early, a massive mistake early is important.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I love that. Do you feel like your time in Australia and kind of having to adjust your interviewing style impacts how you interview today in any ways? Have you brought anything back with you?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I have other than trying to gauge, and now I'm obviously much, much more mature, and have, worked with and interviewed a lot of people to know like kind of when to pump the brake. And I think it's that. I think it's just trying to like detect, use, intuition and again, like body language and any of the cues and signals to be like, oh, well, this person didn't like that question. Or actually, I can probably go even deeper here based on what they're telling me and how like their eyes lit up or something like that. And just seeing that very quickly so that the interview doesn't go off the rails. And so you can pivot if you need to, I'd say is
Mhm.
probably the one thing.
Yeah, that's great. We've talked a lot about kind of the evolution of interviewing in different spheres, content marketing, journalism. Do you have any predictions or thoughts on how interviewing might continue to evolve over the next few years?
Yeah, I don't know if any of this will bear fruit other than the AI one. But I definitely think AI and the chat GPTs of the world will be used more and more for, some of the things we just talked about, researching background info, but even organizing notes, coming up with questions, slightly tweaking questions from subject to subject if they're similar subjects and you sort of need to get the same information out of each of them. Even like taking, it's funny, I will record an interview, but also take notes. I've always been a note taker, even in college. And so even using it to synthesize notes and pull out themes and trends, I think will happen more and more. I think that as consumers and humans and in our work life, continue to toggle between different technology and channels and devices, you'll see interviewing follow suit as well. Like, I think I'm sure it's already happened. I've never personally done it, but like getting quotes over Instagram or TikTok, like in a DM, being able to quickly like DM a source to be like, hey, like I just need one quote on something. Sort of like how consumers shop both online and in store, but even in store, you might be on an app looking for discounts,
Yeah.
or scanning something on your phone. That's how interviewing will be as well. Like you'll have to be comfortable going offline, online, between different channels, because that's just the way we're all living our lives these days. But I think there can be definitely some efficiency in that as well. Like if you don't have to have a 45-minute interview and you can just DM someone or text someone,
Mhm.
why not? And get what you need, why not? So it's
Yeah.
almost going to be like a cool little digital puzzle, I think, to get all the information you need from different people.
Yeah, that's really the term that popped to mind was omni-channel interviewing to riff off omni-channel marketing.
Yes.
That's really interesting. I've never thought about that, especially kind of using Instagram, TikTok to source people, get a quote.
Well, because when you think about it too, a lot of, especially influencers and brands, it's, their PR firms or their publicists might be running that. So they also are the same people managing those channels will likely be the ones that can get approval through like legal or if it's a broader PR team. So it sort of makes sense from that perspective, is sort of the flow, the chain of approval, even to go through that type of channel. It's like
Yeah,
you've hit the right person potentially.
yeah, going straight to the source, the approval source in a way.
Yeah. Because that's where you get, yeah, that's where I've definitely gotten tied up in the past. It's like, oh no, this needs to go through communications and legal, and it's going to take 5 months.
Yes, you will get this someday, maybe, hopefully.
Yes. In 5 years, we can
Yeah,
publish this.
hope that's soon enough. Um, Excellent. I have just a few rapid fire questions to wrap up for you. Number one, do you have a most memorable interview? And if so, why?
So I do, and it's going back to my, early days as a reporter. So my dad actually passed away when I was 16 from hepatitis C. And I wound up interviewing an older gentleman who also had hepatitis C and had gotten a liver transplant. And I don't actually remember what the angle of the story was beyond that, but I was told to interview this man by my editor at the one newspaper in Philadelphia. And he was the loveliest, kind of grandpa of a man. And I shared with him very early on about my dad. And he just warmed up immediately and was the sweetest man. We actually kept in touch for a couple years after the story ran because of the little relationship we had developed. And, I was very young at the time. And he did sadly pass a couple years after I interviewed him. But I think that was a very early example of if I'm vulnerable up front, then the person I'm interviewing with might feel more comfortable being vulnerable or open. And
Yeah.
that's again that sort of common one gem, mindset I talked about in the beginning of like we all have at least one thing in common. So
Yeah, that's really moving. And I love that idea, kind of being willing to give what you want to get back.
yeah.
Cool. Next rapid fire question. Do you have any interviewing muses, inspirations, role models, mentees?
Well, this might be a little controversial, but I did grow up with parents listening to Howard Stern.
Tell me more. Tell me more.
And my husband actually, I don't know if he still, I don't think he really still does, but he definitely did when we first met. And, and I know he can, whatever, he can be raunchy, he can be controversial. Not everybody's a fan, but he's real. And I think he does try to have like an actual conversation versus like an interview slash interrogation. Um, and again, sometimes it goes off the rails in inappropriate ways, but he tries to be authentic. He tries to have his subjects be authentic. Terry Gross, of course, from NPR is amazing, iconic. And former President Obama sort of recognized her, for the same type of style of like getting public figures and really important people who live these incredible lives to kind of share their simple truth in their life and be vulnerable and again, sort of the common humanity that we all have. I really enjoy Anderson Cooper's podcast on grief that came out a couple years ago, All There Is, particularly an episode he had with Stephen Colbert, who, of course, is another great interviewer. On the untimely death of his father, which was kind of similar. I think he was a teenager like me when his father passed away. And I remember that interview very specifically because it was about surpassing the age of your parent when they had died, which I have now actually done by 1 year. So I've heard Anderson interview a lot, but that podcast and that specific episode really stand out to me as something very incredible.
Yeah, definitely sounds like the common trend is kind of people able to get past that surface level stuff, get into the deeper truths.
Yeah, and just, I think it's funny as a culture, it's like in one way we are more buttoned up and about protecting brand and image and reputation, but because there are all these additional channels to sort of express yourself on, social media or otherwise. And, we have Gen Z coming up that really prides itself on like authenticity and authentic connection with each other, but also like the brands they're going to buy from and the media they consume. At the same time, people are willing to be more open. And I know in some ways it's TMI, depending on who you ask, but, I think it's actually a good thing that we're all sort of, as a human species, we've been through a lot in the last, I don't know, 25 years, 5 years, year, 6 months.
Yeah.
I think it's good. I think it's good for us to all talk and be more, human and share, our past and our vulnerabilities and things.
Yeah, totally. I agree. Well, that's a really lovely note to end on. But before we do, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, that you wanted to mention, final advice for other interviewers out there?
I think it just goes with everything we've been talking about and what I just said. Everybody's a human being, even if they're famous, even if they're the president, the king, the queen, Taylor Swift. Like we all started from somewhere. We weren't all famous when we were born. Like find that one common thing. Remember, it's a human being in front of you, not a celebrity or someone with a certain title.
Right. They're not bots yet. They're humans. Yeah.
No. And they probably threw like their mac and cheese across the room when they were two in their high chair, just like you did, right? Like there's something they
Yeah.
had a tantrum at some point, like they had their heart broken. So,
If you dig, you can find it. Yeah.
right.
Awesome. Well, Lauren, this has been so great. Thank you so much for chatting with me for the Interviewist. You had some great gems in there, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate your time as well, and this has been lovely.